Okay, let's get started. Welcome to session 3 of 7 as we go over the agreement of sale. And Tim Brooks and I, we were just joking when we were talking about these pages 5 and 6 that typically the way agents go over them is you look at page 5 and you say, well, the property has public water and it's public sewer. So let's just initial the next 2 pages because nothing else pertains to the deal, right? That's typically how we go over it because many times those things do not pertain to the deal in hand. But it's also important to know what it is just in case it does pop up, or if a client asks you, what the heck is this? You can explain to them and then they can make a judgment for themselves. Oh yeah, it doesn't pertain to this deal. So where we left off, we were talking about the mortgage contingency. Now the next item is paragraph number 9. Okay, and it talks about change in buyer's financial status. So it's in its own little paragraph. It's not part of the mortgage contingency paragraph, paragraph 8. It's off on its own. And what it states is if a change in buyer's financial status affects buyer's ability to purchase, buyer will promptly notify seller and lender to whom the buyer submitted a mortgage application, if any, in writing. A change in financial status includes, but is not limited to, loss or a change in employment, failure or loss of sale of buyer's home, if it was contingent upon, buyers having incurred a new financial obligation, entry of a judgment against buyer. Buyer understands that applying for and or incurring an additional financial obligation may affect buyer's ability to purchase. I wrote in there in the notes, is buyer in default? It doesn't clearly say it, and I don't know what your opinion is of it. We've had it happen in the past, and then the buyer just used the mortgage contingency to get out of the deal and get their deposit money back. I think one of the more memorable one was a young buyer of ours was under contract for a house over in Grandin Farms, one of those townhouses, and in the meantime got engaged, purchased a $12,000 engagement ring, and then his monthly payment, debt to income, was over the limit and he couldn't buy the house now. So I'm not sure if anybody else has experienced this and what you've done. Would love to hear what the outcome was. Nobody? Okay. Brooks, what do you think? Should the buyer be allowed to back out of the deal and get their deposit money back?
So I think that's a tough argument on either side of the fence, right? And typically, the deposit money just ends up going back to the buyer because, like you said, ultimately they lean back on that whole mortgage contingency. It's another catch that they have to get out in addition to this paragraph here. But yeah, it's important to obviously educate your buyer not to make any major financial purchases while they're under contract. And you might need to do that a couple times because even if you say it in the beginning, they tend to forget at times too. There's been plenty of cases we've had where it's not just engagement rings, but cars or stuff like that. And they're not even thinking that buying a car would affect their debt to income ratio. But yeah, you just got to be very upfront with them.
Yeah, and furniture is a big one too. You get closer, especially now when all the story is it takes 12 weeks to get furniture in or whatever, and people are jumping the gun to do it. And these furniture places, they at least take half of a deposit, right, on your credit card. So you have to be very, very careful with that. And again, when things like that come up and you don't know what to do, contact Brooks, myself, or Tim, and we'll certainly help you navigate through it. Okay. And sometimes it's not so much if you're on the list side, it's not even trying to fight against the buyer and their agent, but it's also educating our seller again that, you know, you can go after them, but it's going to be difficult.
Tom?
Yeah.
I have a list that I give to my buyers. It's the list of thou shalt not. If you want me to, I can send it to you.
Yeah, if you can, send that to me, and Brooks will send it out with the video. That'd be awesome.
Great, okay.
We appreciate it. Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, the next paragraph, paragraph 10, and it covers quite a bit. It's actually a whole page and a half almost. But again, this is where we always say, well, it's got public water, public sewer, and that's pretty much it, right? But let's dive into this a little further. Paragraph 10 states seller representations, okay? And the first thing is paragraph A, status of water. The seller represents that the property is served by public water, community water, on-site water, well, none, and then a blank where you can fill in. Why is this box important? First off, it's what the seller is representing. So especially on the list side, you need to make sure that something is checked there, okay? It's also important because the type of loan you're getting, depending on the underwriter and the loan officer, they're going to look at that, and whatever type of water you selected may not qualify for the type of loan they're getting, especially if it's a government-backed loan. So public water, we all know it's just city water, okay? Community water, I don't know of too many places around here with community water. Not even sure if White Rock Acres has that. I know they have community sewer, but not community water. On-site water, well, and then there's none. And then the last checkbox is blank, but does anybody know what other types of water that can go there? Okay.
Kong buddy?
Yeah.
Could be a cistern.
Yes.
I was gonna say cistern.
Yeah.
Well, it could also
Stacy?
be,
Stacy?
isn't on-site water the same as a cistern?
Not always, no. Good question.
Well, it is on site, but you can be absolutely more specific and checkbox that and write in cistern. Yep.
Okay,
So I did write in the notes section there, other sources. And the common one that came up when I did a Google search was surface water, like a lake, stream, river, reservoir, that type of deal. So those are the types of waters, and definitely, especially on the list side, make sure something is checked.
well,
Okay.
we also, in our area, we have holding tanks for waters, like up at the cabins and things.
Yeah,
So we have holding tanks that we put there.
right. Yep. And you can, again, that's one where you can check mark on site or be more specific and just put holding tank.
Holding tank.
Kira,
I also have a question. So I had one where the house was served by a spring. It was run by I had marked it public because they told me it was public, but
Okay.
I'm glad I checked closer to settlement date because it was actually a private water company and the house was served by a spring through that company. So
Okay.
I probably should have used that extra box in that case had I figured it
Right.
out earlier.
yeah, you can check mark that and say spring service by X company.
Right.
Yeah, very good.
And what about pressure tanks? Even though it's public water, like Mountain View and a couple other neighborhoods actually have pressure tanks attached to public water because of, I'm assuming you don't need to mark that on there that there's a pressure tank for public water.
That's a good question.
I would think that goes in
That would
the
be public.
disclosure
Yeah,
statement.
Yeah.
Ben?
Seth?
Yeah, that's a great question, but if it's sometimes public water comes from many resources. Public water can come from reservoirs, rivers, lakes, springs, wells, many different resources, but if it's public, it's usually public.
Right. Awesome. The next paragraph is paragraph B, status of sewer. Okay, so the easiest one is public sewer, right? Seller represents that the property is served by public sewer. The next one is community sewage disposal system. So in our area, that I know of, we have a community called White Rock Acres down in Monroe Township, Cumberland Valley School District. And they have a community sewage disposal system, which I think actually Monroe Township has taken over now, but irregardless, it's there in the neighborhood. And one of the common thing with those is it's paid for by the community. Okay, it's not paid for by everybody. It's just the people in White Rock Acres. And I think I'm not sure what the story was behind that, but they may have had a system upgrade or something recently. And by recent, I said meaning the past 10 years. Their quarterly sewer fee is $350. So if you break that down, that's about $115, $116 a month. The average public sewer bill is probably right around $50 to $60 now. So you're looking at twice as much. Okay, so there is the possibility of it being more expensive than your traditional public sewer. Okay, because it's almost like a condo for sewer. Everybody shares in the expense. Okay. The next item I list is the 10-acre exemption. And then it says see sewage notice number 2. Okay. Now, notice number 2, you notice down here where it's like salmon color there that I highlighted, pretty much states that this property is serviced by a sewage system installed under the 10-acre permit exemption. So permit may not be required before install or altering. Buyer is advised soil testing not conducted, and the owner of the property serviced by system at time of malfunction may be held liable for contamination and public health hazards. Okay. So some of these farmettes and properties that have 10+ acres, when the system was installed, they may have just installed the system without asking the township or getting any kind of permit, which is fine because I guess there is an act that states that if you have 10+ acres, you don't have to do that in certain places. However, if it does malfunction and there's contaminant running from it, the homeowner is responsible for that. So you may want to ask or call the township or contact the SEO and ask them, if they have any history on a property, especially those with the 10+ acres. Okay, I'm not sure, has anybody ever ran into this locally or anything like that? Okay. So just be aware that that's out there, okay? The next one right below it, back to paragraph 1, is individual on-lot sewage disposal system, see sewage notice number 1. And then right below that, individual on-lot sewage disposal system in proximity to well, see notice number 1 and see notice number 4. Okay. And then none, see notice number 1. So what's this notice number 1? Okay. Back down here. Notice number 1 states that if you are going to construct, fix, alter a septic system, you must first obtain a permit. Buyer should contact local agency in charge to determine procedure and requirements. Okay, so again, this is a notice to the buyer that they should do research on this before they commit to buying the property. Okay. Holding tank in purple there. See sewage notice number 3. Okay. So what is the definition of a holding tank? Notice number 3 states, this property is serviced by a holding tank, permanent or temporary, to which sewer is conveyed by a water carrying system and which is designed and constructed to facilitate ultimate disposal of the sewage at another site. Pursuant to the Pennsylvania Sewage Facilities Act, seller must provide a history of the annual cost of maintaining the tank from the date of its installation or December 14th, 1995, whichever is later. So holding tanks is kind of frowned upon by a lot of government-backed loans, okay? Now, there are instances where you can get the SEO to write you a letter and say, a holding tank is common for our area, and that may be sufficient enough for VA or FHA or USDA to give you the loan. Has anybody ever gotten a letter from an SEO to do that, to bypass that? Seth, you're shaking your head. Okay, I think I've done that once and it did not work, and the lender still would not grant us the loan. So just be careful if you see a holding tank to consult with your loan officer first before putting in an offer. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay. Notice number 4 with the individual on-lot sewage disposal system in proximity to well. Okay. So notice number 4, I'm going to scroll to the next page here because I drew a little diagram here. Everybody can see that? It's stating that the water supply needs to be 50 feet from the treatment tank. And then the water supply needs to be 100 feet from the absorption area. Okay. I think I've heard some agents say it needs to be 100 feet from the treatment tank, which isn't correct. It needs to be 50 feet. But again, it depends on the lender and the type of loan you're getting. You need to consult with them and find out what their requirement is, again, before you put in an offer. There are circumstances, again, with this, that you can get a letter from the SEO where he can write and say, this is common for the area for the tank to be 40 feet or less than 50 feet from the water supply, or less than 100 feet from the absorption area. And you may be able to bypass that, but it's not very common. So just be aware of that. Okay. And then lastly, none available permit limitation in effect, see notice number 5. Okay. So what is notice number 5? Notice number 5 states, this lot is within an area in which permit limitations are in effect and is subject to those limitations. Sewage facilities are not available for this lot, and construction of a structure to be served by sewage facilities may not begin until the municipality completes a major planning requirement pursuant to the PA Sewage Facilities Act and regulations promulgated thereunder. Okay. So in my notes, I wrote down, what the heck is promulgated mean? And the definition of it is promote or make widely known. The definition of thereunder is in accordance with the thing mentioned. So there are some areas right now where there is I guess they call it a moratorium on public sewer. You can't tap into their public sewer until the township does an improvement to the system so that it can handle extra sewage going through there. So if you sell a lot and a builder can't build a house on it because he can't connect to the sewer, that becomes a problem. And one of the ways you can avoid that is to contact the township or whoever services the sewer system and ask them if there is any limitations right now on it. Okay. Has anybody experienced that in this area?
Yes, Emily does in our area.
Where at, Emily?
St. Thomas, Pennsylvania.
West.
That's west of Chambersburg. So back in the day when I worked for a civil engineering firm, I actually designed planning modules for septic systems. And St. Thomas was basically, their treatment center was too full. And they wouldn't allow anyone to tap into their public sewer until they got that problem figured out. And I think it was years it was like that. But just recently, like within the last week, my husband and I are building a house out there and we were able to tap in it with no problem. So it just waves on how much poo they got and they have to take care of.
Right. Thank you for the description. Yeah, so just again, be careful and have the buyer or you call, preferably the buyer, call the township and find out if there are any limitations on the sewer system, okay? All right, so any questions on sewer there? We'll go into a little more next week when we talk about the inspection end of it. But right now, that's basically the seller's disclosure representation of the different types of sewer. So this is very important on the list side too. Now, if you notice that a buyer agent made a mistake, you definitely should change that before the execution of the contract, okay? Paragraph C, historic preservation. Seller is not aware of historic preservation restrictions regarding the property unless otherwise stated here, okay? And one of the things on these older homes that I look for is if there is some kind of plaque on the property, usually right by the front door. And if there is, then that's your kind of key code to research a little more, because a historic preservation is almost like an HOA where they restrict what you can and can't do to the property. You might not even be able to re-side the property, change the color of the door, change the windows, okay? Especially if they have glass blown windows, you might not be able to alter that and change the vinyl double pane replacement. The type of roofs, you know, if they have a slate roof, you can't just change it to a 30-year composite, okay? That type of thing. So just make sure that you do your research on that, especially on a home that's older. And usually the seller will tell you too in the disclosure, because a lot of times people who buy historic homes buy it because it's a historic home. So the definition online that I looked up too about historic preservation, and I have it in the notes there, may be restricted in alteration, decoration, new development and use, and may have affirmative responsibilities related to upkeep and conformance with historic standards. Okay. That just sounds very limited and very expensive. So just be aware of that, okay? All right, next section, D, land use. Different land uses for properties. So number one, property or portion of it is subject to land use restrictions and may be preferentially assessed for tax purposes under the following act. See notices regarding land use restrictions below. Okay, so if the property falls under any of these 5 boxes below, box 1 should be check marked, okay, next to paragraph 1. And then you obviously have to check mark one of the following below. So Agricultural Area Security Law, or Right to Farm Act, okay? Paragraph 2, right below it, describes, these are the notices for paragraph 1, okay? So the Pennsylvania Right to Farm Act. The property you are buying may be located in an area where agricultural operations take place, okay? Pennsylvania protects agricultural resources for the production of food and agricultural products. The law limits circumstances where normal agricultural operations may be subject to nuisance lawsuits or restrictive ordinances. Okay, so you buy a property next to a farm and they're loud, okay, and you complain. Well, the farm may be protected from that nuisance. So that's just letting the buyer be aware that that is going on. Okay. Next one, Farmland and Forest Land Assessment Act, also known as Clean and Green Act. This is probably the most common one. If we check mark anything at all in our area, is this, the Clean and Green program. So properties enrolled in the Clean and Green program receive preferential property tax assessment. Buyer and seller have been advised of the need to contact the county tax assessment office before the execution of this agreement to determine the property tax implications that will or may result from the sale of the property, or that may result in the future as a result of any change in use of the property or the land from which it is being separated. Okay. So the Clean and Green Act, okay, and we'll scroll down to my little notes here. I had sold 100 acres once in Silver Spring, and it was in Clean and Green, obviously, and they were being taxed, I believe at the time, like $2,000 a year. That was it. The normal taxes on it would have been $9,000. So they were saving $7,000 a year because it was in Clean and Green. Now, my buyer wanted to take it out of Clean and Green and do a development. So we contacted the assessment office and our local tax, county tax office, and just found out what the implications were to do that. And at that time, the implication was you had to pay back 7 years worth of the difference. Okay, so 7 times 7,000, we had to pay $49,000. Okay, and it's important to know because that's on the buyer. Okay, however, while you're working the deal and negotiating, it's a negotiable item. So instead of offering them, 1.25 million, we went down to 1.2 million to cover that $50,000 in tax implications. Okay, so again, in my little notes there, you pay back 7 years of back taxes if change in use or separated. So Clean and Green taxes are $4,000, and the normal taxes would have been $7,500. You have to pay back 7 years of the $3,500 difference, and that is $24,500 that the new owner is responsible for. Okay. Does anybody have any questions on that? Okay. About 3 years ago, maybe 2 years, I had a property in Lower Dauphin that I was competing against with another agent, actually two other agents. And this gentleman owned a property that had 6 acres and 7 acres. And he owned them both, and they were touching one another. And his taxes on this property was $14,000 a year. It was in Lower Dauphin, so it was very high taxed area. And when I looked up the property and noticed he was not in Clean and Green, I contacted the local Clean and Green office in Dauphin County, and they told me that yes, he could qualify. It has to be 10 acres, but it could be 2 parcels adding up to 10 acres as long as they are touching and owned by the same person. So they looked at it and told me that yes, he qualified. So this gentleman has owned this property for almost 30 years, and his taxes went down from 14 grand to 6,000.
Wow.
So think about this, $8,000 a year times 30 years, that's almost $250,000 he paid extra. But it was important for me to do that because now I can advertise a house that's in Clean and Green, an $800,000 house with taxes of $6,500 instead of $414. And guess how many buyers that opened up to when the monthly payment goes down by $500 a month. Okay, so needless to say, I did get the listing, and we helped them fill out the paperwork and mailed it in, and the new buyers, and I just checked the other day while I was doing this, they are benefiting from that now. So just a thing to keep in mind, especially when you go out and look at these properties that have 10+ acres, to see if they are in Clean and Green, and if not, see if you can help them get it in there, or at least call around and find out. Okay.
So I have a quick question. So if you had, let's say someone has 40 acres.
Yeah.
And they want to subdivide part of it off, and they're only going to subdivide like 5 acres off
Sure.
to sell. Then they're only responsible for the tax implication for that 5 acres.
I haven't experienced that, Stacy, but from my understanding, once you contact the Clean and Green, they'll work out the math there.
Okay.
Yeah, because remember, the new buyer still has to apply to be in Clean and Green as well. So they'll have to apply, and they'll look at, okay, now we have 5 acres. What's that taxed at? And then we have this
Okay.
35 acres that was once 40. So what are we going to tax that at?
Okay.
So obviously the 35 will probably go down, right, from the 40.
Right.
But now we have a whole new tax implication for the 5 acres.
Okay.
So, hey, Colin.
Yeah.
I actually have lived through that. So I own a piece of property that's like 27 acres.
Okay.
And then next to it was my husband's grandparents. They both passed away.
Okay.
And nobody cared about the land except us because it was our neighbor. So we got the land from the family,
Mm-hmm.
and it's 9.5 acres. Because it was adjacent to ours, we were able to put it into Clean and Green.
Yep.
But the kicker is it has a house on it that needs demolished. And for us, originally we thought we'll just build a house, like tear that down, build a new one and rent it. Because there's a big garage that is an asset to us. But to rent the new house that we would build, we couldn't do that. We would have to take it out of Clean and Green, pay the back taxes, because that's an income now from that
Right.
property. So it's anytime it would change the use, you have to go back and pay the taxes that you benefited from.
Right. Very good advice. Yep.
Hey,
So-
Kong, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Seth.
Actually, my question is, Emily Weaver, what haven't you done in life? I think you should write a book. Sorry, just wanted to throw that in there.
That's funny. Okay.
Kong,
Yeah, go ahead, Brooks?
Yeah, sorry, just one other little thing I wanted to add to clean and green. I know there is an exception too. If you have a buyer and they're looking at a property just slightly under 10 acres, I'm blanking on the exact details, but you can actually still qualify for clean and green if you have some type of agricultural service that nets you a certain amount of money. And I think the threshold's pretty low, like $1,500 or $2,500 a year. So if you're like selling eggs or something like that, you can still get the benefit of clean and green without having the full 10 acres.
Maybe that's why we see so many beekeepers around here.
Mhm.
Right?
Hey,
That would
this is
qualify.
true. I
Hmm?
just wanted to say that recently I actually was showing a property that was just under 10 acres and I started asking questions. And so it was like $2,000 a year that they had to prove that they were making off of the land. So it's like plant the seed, grow the crop, sell the crop. And as long as they could show the local authority that they were making $2,000 a year off of the land itself, then they would still qualify for clean and green. And they were like 8 acres or something like
Right.
that.
Now, one last comment. I showed a house once right by Hershey Park. The property had a nice contemporary house, a tennis court, and it sat on 9.97 acres. And we called, and the clean and green and the assessor there, and it did not qualify. They were pretty dead set on having 10. And again, you'd have to prove what Brooks and Kira just said about making income off the land in order for it to qualify for the clean and green. The taxes on that house was right around $13,000 a year. So that's pretty substantial, you know.
Yeah, it's a huge benefit if you do get the qualification.
It saves it anywhere between 40 to 50% off. It's pretty substantial. All right, the next item, C, Open Space Act. All right. States here, this act enables counties to enter into covenants with owners of the land designated as farm, forest, water supply, or open space land on an adopted municipal, county, or regional plan for the purpose of preserving the land as open space. A covenant between the owner and county is binding upon any buyer of the property during the period of time that the covenant is in effect, 5 or 10 years. Covenants automatically renew at the end of the covenant period unless specific termination notice procedures are followed. Buyer has been advised of the need to determine the restrictions that will apply from the sale of the property to buyer and the property tax implications that will or may result from a change in use of the property or any portion of it. Buyer is further advised to determine the term of any covenant now in effect. So again, these things are notices, okay? And they're not contingencies or anything like that. These are notices. And if you notice, when I read through that, it talks about the buyer having to do this, the buyer needs to do that. So again, these are notices for the buyer. So as a buyer agent, you need to advise the buyer that this is on them to research and make sure that they are okay with. So I guess the Open Space Act, there is no clear definition of the Open Space Act. When I Googled it, it actually even said that there was no clear definition of open space. But if you buy a property and let's say the back end of it has some kind of easement or public access for people to, let's say, access a park or a baseball field or something, that's part of the property that they have a right to access to get to the open space. So if the buyer wants to change that in future, they need to research on how to do it and what are the tax implications, because they may be getting a break because they're sharing their land. Okay. Seth, did you have a question?
Not any pertinent
Okay,
questions here?
I thought you were about to say something, but
Nope.
So
I'm not sure if
just- I just
anybody's
want to
gone
make sure
through
I
this.
understand. So the Open Space Act is if you own land
Mhm.
that is allowed to be utilized by some other entity, basically.
Yes.
Okay,
Yep. And it's usually, Stacy, the county or municipality or something like that. The only time I've seen this locally is a house sits on land and the back portion of it, and I use the ballpark because there's a baseball field behind it. The outfield is part of is on these people's land. So, and they're getting a break because of it. Okay.
Kong.
Yeah.
So I have seen it in designing new developments, particularly something that would be like an older folks development, or where they all kind of had the same house and you want to keep it very the same. And they didn't have big yards, but they would have, if you had 2 rows of houses, in between it would be like a blob of shared space that somebody has to maintain. And if they didn't want to have create an HOA, they would say, well, unit number 10 is gonna mow that, and they would get usually a price discount on the land or the house
Right.
to kind of entice them to buy it, but they would have to mow it.
Right.
It also happens when they have stormwater basins, and you see like in the development, there's a big basin and there's a house right beside it. It's written in the deed that that owner of the house maintains that basin. And it gets you away from having HOAs where nobody pays or they argue and nobody wants to run it. It takes that responsibility away from creating some kind of board to control it. It just puts the responsibility on that one landowner.
Emily, so glad you brought that up. Locally here, not even a quarter mile away from our office, is a neighborhood called Good Hope South, developed by the McNaughtons. And when we started selling houses in there in the initial stages of the neighborhood, when we represented Tidy there, they kept saying that, and that's McNaughton, that once the neighborhood is 80% complete to 100%, they're going to have an HOA. Okay.
Right.
And it's going to be like $60. Don't worry about it. It's nothing. But
Right.
somewhere along the line, they decided not to have an HOA.
Right.
Okay?
It happens all the time.
Yep. And then all of a sudden, these retention ponds behind people's houses are now the responsibility of the homeowner.
Yep.
And the problem then is the township rules, and Hampton Township requires you to have somebody come out and inspect it, an engineer, at least once or twice, maybe once a year, or is it every other year? Irregardless, they have to come out and you have to pay for it and let the township know the result of that inspection. So
Right. Yeah,
glad
that's
you brought
common
that up.
here too.
Yep.
The same
So,
thing.
Yep. So just be careful with that, especially if you sell a house that has a retention pond on.
Yeah, it'll most likely will be recorded in the deed.
Right. Yep. And that's why there is no HOA, because there is no common ground.
Right.
Okay. All right, the last one, Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program. Just states that properties enrolled in the Conservation Reserve Program are environmentally sensitive areas, the owners of which receive compensation in exchange for an agreement to maintain the land in its natural state. Contracts last from 10 to 15 years and carry penalties to seller if terminated early by buyer. buyer has been advised of the need to determine the restrictions on development of the property and the term of any new contract now in effect. Seller is advised to determine the financial implications that will or may result from the sale of the property. That sounds like this puts the onus on the seller, doesn't it? Not the buyer.
Kyra has something for you, Kong.
Yes.
This is true. I had people, we were gonna write an offer and we didn't anyway. You're probably like, how does she know about all this stuff? I don't see even any deals come through. But,
We
so-
live in farm country, so everything gets hit here.
So there was a property that we were interested in, so we started doing some research on this, and the way that it worked was they had a field basically that was mowed once a year by the seller. They were part of the CREP program. They got paid a fee basically just to keep that field as it was and mowed for whatever. But they had to pay a penalty since they were selling the property. They had to pay a penalty to exit the program. And then the buyer had 30 days from the sale to determine whether they wanted to enter back into the program or just be done with it completely. So
Mhm.
it was definitely, like you said, on the seller to discontinue from
Right.
that program and pay whatever penalty that they had to.
Right. Now, I wonder if the buyer went back on the program, if the seller got the money back.
I don't know that.
Yeah,
Probably not.
I'll have to
Yeah,
ask around
I
about
would say
that.
probably not.
Okay. All right, I'll have to find out more about that. Maybe next time I'll just make a quick comment in session number 4. All right. Paragraph E talks about the real estate disclosure law. The seller in a residential real estate transfer must make certain disclosures regarding the property to potential buyers in a form defined by law. Okay, so what is a form that is defined by law? The seller's property disclosure that we use in zip forms given to us by PAR. Okay. I did write a comment here, and maybe this will help us maybe get more FSBOs. Do FSBOs have to disclose?
Yes,
And if so, how are they doing it?
or not.
Right, John? So I don't know, if I was
That is
calling
correct.
FSBO, and I have a good conversation with them and I want to get their listing, I may want to talk to them about the legality of the sale. Okay, how are you disclosing this, Mr. Seller, on your own? Okay, because part of our service here is we help you navigate through that and keep the liability off of you as much as we can. Okay, so I highlighted the fact that not less than 1 and not more than 4 residential dwelling units are involved. So if you have 1 unit, 2 unit, 3 unit, or 4 unit, you have to fill out a disclosure. Okay, if it's a 5 unit, do you have to fill one out? Technically, no, right? Okay. The last 3 sentences there. Disclosures for condominiums and cooperatives are limited to the seller's particular unit. Disclosure regarding common areas or facilities are not required, as those elements are already addressed in the laws that govern the resale of condominium and cooperative interests. And I wrote in there the resale cert. Okay, so let's say you have you're in a condominium and the fees are going up. Okay, and they haven't gone up yet. They may go up later this year. Okay, or in 2 or 3 months. Does that need to be disclosed?
Okay, hold on 1 second. I'll look it up for you.
Or should that be disclosed in the resale cert? Seth?
I just have to get logged in.
It should be disclosed in the resale.
Sorry, Seth, you got muted there, bud. I'm sorry.
Okay, you said the corner of Second and what?
There you are, Seth.
Yeah, so it should be disclosed in the resale cert because that's the whole definition or the whole reasoning to obtain a resale cert. Now, a lot of times, and we've had this quite a bit, there are some local HOAs where just this year a new roof was needed or something was needed. And there's certainly an extra letter sent to the homeowner. But to answer the question, yes, all of that should be in the resale cert because that's the definition of getting one.
Right. Okay. Not that if you know about it, I would probably disclose it somewhere in the MLS system under the agent notes or whatever that, hey, you know, per a meeting that happened on such and such date, have been talked and agreed upon that the dues will be raised here in about 2 months. Okay. You just don't want to be an angry buyer thinking that you withheld information from them. Okay. Although this paragraph here protects you in case you do forget about it or did know about it. Okay. Because it's part of the resale. Okay. F, public and or private assessments. Paragraph 1. Seller represents that as of the date seller signed this agreement, no public improvement, condominium or homeowner association assessments have been made against the property which remain unpaid, and that no notice by any government or public authority has been served upon seller or anyone on seller's behalf, including notices relating to violations of zoning, housing, building, safety, or fire ordinances that remain uncorrected, and that seller knows of no condition that would constitute a violation of any such ordinance that remain uncorrected unless otherwise specified here. Okay. Let's say the township went around and said, hey, Mr. Seller, Mr. Homeowner, your sidewalk needs repaired. That probably should go here if you're selling the property and haven't made the repair, correct? Okay. Number 2, seller knows of no other potential notices, potential is underlined, and or assessments except as follows. Okay, so paragraph number 2 here talks about the potential notices. Okay. Any
Hey,
question on F?
Hey, Kong.
Yes.
Hey, couldn't that also be like, you know, they decide to put new street lamps in a community or something and they split the cost among the residents, like community improvements, that kind of thing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. The more you give the info, the better. Okay, especially if it's in the HOA and you don't know about it, because there are people that they just live in an HOA and they don't really care what goes on and don't go to any meetings and don't know anything about it. At least this does protect you, that it does state that, you know, it's part of the resale cert. Okay. Paragraph G, highway occupancy permit. Access to public road may require highway occupancy permit from the Department of Transportation. Again, this isn't a contingency of the deal. This is a notice to the buyer. Okay, so if you want an extra driveway and it's on Route 11, you're going to have to ask the Department of Transportation if you can do that. Okay. Paragraph H. Internet of Things devices. So number 1, the presence of smart and green home devices that are capable of connecting to the internet directly or indirectly. So directly means plugged in, or indirectly to me means wireless or Bluetooth. And the data stored on those various devices make up a digital ecosystem in the property, sometimes referred to as the Internet of Things. Buyer and seller acknowledge that Internet of Things devices may transmit data to third parties outside of the control of their owner. Okay, so paragraph 1 is a notice to both the buyer and the seller that, hey, your ring may transmit data to a third party that neither party has a control over. Okay, so just keep in mind, paragraph 1 is for a notice for the buyer and seller. Okay, paragraph 2 is a notice for the seller. On or before settlement, seller will make a reasonable effort to clear all data stored on all IoT devices located on the property and included in the sale. Okay, so if they're taking it with them, it doesn't matter. Seller further acknowledges that all personal devices owned by seller, including but not limited to seller cell phones, personal computers, and tablets, have connectivity to any IoT devices located on the property will be disconnected and cleared of relevant data prior to settlement. Further, no attempts will be made after settlement by seller or anyone on seller's behalf to access any IoT devices remaining on the property. So you have a ring and you still have it on your phone or your computer, you are to disconnect that. Okay, and anybody you know, whether it's your spouse, your kids, your parents, they should not have access to it either, and you will make any attempt to clear those. Okay, so number 2 is a notice for the seller on these devices. Number 3 is a notice for the buyer. Okay, so 3 states, following settlement, buyer will make a reasonable effort to clear all stored data from any IoT devices remaining on the property and to restrict access to said device by seller. Seller's agents or any third party to whom seller may have previously provided access. This includes but is not limited to restoring IoT devices to the original settings, changing passwords or codes, updating network settings, and submitting change of ownership and contact info to device manufacturers and service providers. Hardwired security systems comes to mind, right? How many times have you gotten the call from the buyer, hey, the alarm's going off, what's the 4-digit code, right? So again, this puts the onus on the buyer as well to make an effort to clear all the data so that the seller can't have access. Okay, so it's kind of telling, number 2 is telling the seller to clear it, and number 3 is telling the buyer to make sure the seller has cleared it. Okay, and then lastly, paragraph number 4 there, this paragraph will survive settlement. So settlement happens and 2 weeks later, the seller's accessing the ring. That's a no-no. Okay, and then it becomes the buyer's responsibility to make sure they change the access so that the seller can't get access to it anymore. Okay, we're going to stop there because 11 starts to talk about waiver of contingency, and next week we're going to dive into the home inspection portion of the contract. I didn't want to start it and then just stop halfway. So does anybody have any questions on pages 5 and 6 that we went over today? Okay. Appreciate all the feedback and everybody that was active today and watching this video. Again, next week, same time, same place, we'll go over pages part of 6, 7, and 8, and hopefully we'll have a better understanding of the home inspection process. Okay?
Okay, thank you, Con.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Kong. Yep, bye-bye.
See ya.